The Exile. In the vast expanse of the Andromeda Galaxy, there existed a planet called Terrania. Its inhabitants valued strength and size above everything else. To be small was to be weak, and to be weak was to be unworthy. Lyra had always been different. Standing barely half the height of her peers, she had spent her entire life enduring ridicule, judgment, and isolation. Her parents tried to protect her, but on Terrania, compassion was a luxury few could afford. The Council of Elders, the planet's ruling body, had strict laws. Anyone deemed unfit for survival would be exiled. Lyra had hoped to prove them wrong, to show that size wasn't everything, but her efforts were in vain. The Council saw only what they wanted to see, a tiny failure. The day of her exile arrived with a cruel finality. The city square, a massive arena carved into the planet's rocky terrain, was packed with towering Tyranians. Their expressions ranged from indifference to outright disgust as Lyra was brought forward. Her wrists were bound in glowing restraints that hummed with energy, ensuring she couldn't resist. The High Elder, a hulking figure draped in golden robes, stepped forward. His voice boomed across the arena. "Lyra of House Krenar, you are hereby exiled for your inadequacies. You have no place among the strong, no purpose among the worthy. Your existence weakens our society." Lyra looked up at him, her violet eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but she refused to cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, she spoke, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Strength isn't just about size. One day, you'll all see that." A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. The High Elder smirked. "Words of the weak mean nothing." With a signal from his hand, the guards led her to the edge of the arena, where a swirling, unstable wormhole awaited. The Exile Gate, as it was called, was a one-way ticket to the unknown. Most who entered it were never heard from again. Some claimed it led to the farthest corners of the galaxy, while others believed it was a death sentence. Lyra stood before the gate, the energy crackling against her skin. She turned one last time to look at the crowd. The faces of her people were etched with disdain, but in the farthest corner she spotted her mother, tears streaming down her face. Lyra wanted to reach out, to say goodbye, but there was no time. A guard shoved her forward. "Move, outcast." As Lyra stumbled into the gate, the world around her dissolved into chaos. Lights flashed, sounds roared, and the sensation of being pulled apart and put back together overwhelmed her. She closed her eyes, clutching the small pendant around her neck, a gift from her father, a reminder of the few who had truly cared for her. Then, silence. Lyra opened her eyes slowly. She was no longer on Terrania. The sky above her was a brilliant shade of blue, unlike anything she had ever seen. The ground beneath her was soft and covered in green blades that tickled her fingers. She sat up, her heart pounding as she took in her surroundings. In the distance, she saw strange, towering structures made of metal and glass, and odd creatures moving about on two legs. They were like her in shape but smaller than the Tyranians. For the first time in her life, Lyra wasn't the tiniest being around. Curiosity mingled with fear as she stood, brushing herself off. She didn't know where she was. But one thing was clear, this was no ordinary world. She took a tentative step forward, her senses heightened. The air was rich with unfamiliar scents, and strange sounds filled her ears. Birds chirped from the trees, and distant engines rumbled like low growls. Despite the beauty of the place, Lyra felt the weight of her situation. She was alone, stranded on an alien world with no way back. But as the moments passed, a spark of determination ignited within her. She had survived the judgment of her people and the chaos of the Exile Gate. Whatever this world held, she would face it head-on. She whispered to herself, "They thought I was weak. Let's see what this tiny outcast can do." Unbeknownst to her, hidden among the trees, a pair of human eyes watched her every move. A quiet voice crackled over a radio. "We've got something. Definitely not from Earth. Should we approach?" The reply came after a tense pause. Not yet. Let's see what it does. Lyra had no idea that her arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. She was being watched, and her journey was only beginning. Discovery on Earth. Lyra's first steps on Earth were cautious and unsteady. Her alien feet pressed into the soft, green terrain, unlike the hard, rocky surface of Terrania. The vibrant colors around her were almost overwhelming. On her home planet, everything was a dull gray or metallic hue. Here, the air smelled fresh, laced with a mix of unknown but pleasant scents. It was beautiful, but beauty didn't mean safety. Her violet eyes darted around, scanning for threats. She had no idea what creatures lived on this planet, or if they would see her as a friend or food. The towering structures she had seen earlier loomed in the distance. They glinted under the sunlight, standing in stark contrast to the lush greenery around her. Lyra couldn't decide whether to head toward them or stay hidden. Instinct urged her to be cautious. On Terrania, small creatures didn't survive long without being eaten or crushed. For all she knew, this world operated the same way. She crouched low, her small frame blending into the tall grass, and decided to observe her surroundings. That's when she saw them. Two strange creatures, bipedal like her but significantly smaller than Tyranians, emerged from the trees ahead. They were covered in odd fabrics, their skin shades varying from pale to a deep brown. Lyra's heart raced. She wasn't sure if they were intelligent beings or predators. Their movements were slow and deliberate, and they held strange, sleek objects in their hands. Weapons, perhaps. She stayed perfectly still, hoping the grass would conceal her. But one of the creatures, a male, suddenly froze and raised a hand to his companion. "Did you see that?" he whispered. The second one, a female, frowned. "What?" "I swear something moved over there," he said, pointing toward the patch of grass where Lyra crouched. Her muscles tensed. Should she run, stay hidden, or step out and face whatever these beings were? The female shook her head. Probably just a rabbit or something. "Come on, we're wasting time." Lyra exhaled quietly as they moved on, their voices fading into the distance. But her relief was short-lived. She realized she couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later, she would have to interact with this world and its inhabitants. As the day wore on, Lyra explored cautiously, staying close to the forested area. She discovered strange plants with bright, colorful fruits and creatures that scurried on four legs or flew in the air. None of them seemed particularly threatening, but she remained on edge. Hunger began to gnaw at her. The last meal she'd had was before her exile, and the memory of it felt like a lifetime ago. Her stomach growled, and she eyed the fruits hanging from a nearby tree. Were they safe to eat? She had no idea, but she couldn't afford to be picky. She reached for a round red fruit and sniffed it. It smelled sweet. Hesitantly, she took a small bite. The taste was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Juicy, tangy, and strangely satisfying. She devoured the fruit quickly, then grabbed another for later. As the sun began to set, Lyra found herself drawn toward the towering structures. From a distance, she could see lights flickering on and strange vehicles moving along black paths. Her curiosity overpowered her caution. If these beings were intelligent enough to build such things, perhaps they could help her, or at least provide answers about where she was. She crept closer, sticking to the shadows. The area was busier than she expected. Dozens of the bipedal creatures moved about, talking, laughing, and carrying objects. They seemed harmless enough, but Lyra knew better than to trust appearances. She ducked behind a large metal container, watching the scene unfold. That's when she noticed one of the creatures staring directly at her. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had she been spotted? She froze, hoping the shadows would conceal her. But the creature didn't move. It was a young child, much smaller than the others, with wide eyes full of curiosity. The child pointed. "Mommy, look. There's something over there." A taller figure turned to look, her gaze sharp. Lyra panicked. She turned and bolted back into the forest, her small frame moving swiftly through the trees. She didn't stop until she was sure no one was following her. Panting, she leaned against a tree and tried to calm her racing heart. It was clear now. This world was full of beings who might notice her. If she wasn't careful, she could easily end up captured or worse. Unbeknownst to Lyra, she had already drawn the attention of a group far more dangerous than a curious child. In a dimly lit room filled with monitors, a man in a dark suit leaned forward, studying the grainy footage from a hidden camera in the forest. "There," he said, pausing the video. On the screen was a blurry image of Lyra's figure as she crouched in the grass. "What is it?" asked a voice behind him. The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed as he replayed the footage, zooming in on her unusual features, her glowing violet eyes, her silvery hair, and her small but distinctly alien frame. "It's not human," he finally said. The voice behind him chuckled. "Well, that's interesting. Should we make contact?" "Not yet," the man replied. "Let's see what it does first. But keep a team ready. I have a feeling this one's going to be special." Back in the forest, Lyra stared up at the night sky, her mind racing with questions. She had survived her first day on Earth, but she knew this was only the beginning, the first encounter. Lyra woke up to the strange chirps of Earth's creatures. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft golden light over the landscape. Her eyes opened slowly, the weight of the previous day settling on her mind. She had spent the night in the trees, as they provided more cover than the open ground. Her body was sore from the unfamiliar terrain, but there was a new sense of resolve inside her. She was still alive, and that meant there was a chance for survival. She took a deep breath of the cool morning air and looked out over the unfamiliar land. The forest stretched in all directions, but beyond it, the glittering lights of the human settlement called to her once again. She knew it was risky, but she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed to know more about this world and its inhabitants. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she needed food. But as she ventured toward the settlement, her mind wasn't just on hunger. Her thoughts kept circling back to the mysterious humans she had seen the day before. What kind of creatures were they? Would they be a threat, or could they help her? What if they knew about the wormhole and why she was here? As Lyra approached the settlement, she kept to the trees, moving silently. Her small size was an advantage in this situation. She was almost invisible in the dense forest. She peeked out cautiously from behind the underbrush and saw a group of humans. They were standing by a large, noisy machine that seemed to be a vehicle of some sort, talking to each other in a language she didn't understand. She was about to retreat when a voice cut through the air, drawing her attention. "You see anything unusual in the forest?" Lyra froze. The voice was familiar, the same one from the day before, the one that had asked about her presence. She slowly turned to see the child from earlier, standing alone on the edge of the forest. The child was looking directly at her hiding spot, but their expression wasn't one of fear or suspicion. It was curiosity. Lyra's heart pounded. She hadn't expected to be noticed so soon, but now that she had been, she had to act. She stayed perfectly still, praying that the child wouldn't come closer. To her relief, the child simply stood there for a moment, looking around as though they hadn't seen anything at all, before turning and walking back toward the group of humans. But the moment the child was out of sight, Lyra breathed a quiet sigh of relief. She didn't have much time. If the child went back to the others and reported what they saw, things could get complicated. Her best bet was to observe, but from a distance. The next few hours were spent cautiously following the humans from the shadows. She watched as they moved about the settlement, busy with their own tasks. From what she could tell, they didn't seem to notice her at all. At least, not in the way they had before. They were too focused on their own lives, unaware that an alien had stepped into their world. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Lyra's curiosity grew. She ventured closer to one of the larger structures, a building made of metal and glass that seemed to be the center of human activity. She watched from a distance as people entered and exited, chatting and laughing among themselves. Some were dressed in similar clothing to the child, while others wore more formal attire. Suddenly, she heard a voice from behind her. A voice she recognized. "Hey, there you are again." Lyra whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing just a few feet away was the same child from earlier. Their eyes were wide with wonder, but there was no fear, just an innocent curiosity that made Lyra hesitate. The child smiled, stepping closer. "What are you doing in the woods? You look like I don't know, like a fairy or something." Lyra was speechless for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had never met a human before, and her knowledge of their language was limited to what she had overheard. But the child's friendly demeanor confused her. She had expected fear or hostility, not this open curiosity. I'm just exploring," Lyra said in the simplest terms she could manage, her voice soft and unsure. The child tilted their head. "You're lost, aren't you? Do you need help?" For a moment, Lyra was stunned. This child, this small human, was offering to help her, a complete stranger, without hesitation. Could she trust them? Should she trust them? "Help?" Lyra asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. She couldn't risk leading them to where she was hiding. If they discovered her true nature, it could be dangerous. "I won't tell anyone, I promise," the child said quickly, almost as if reading her mind. "I just want to know who you are. Are you from another country?" The sincerity in their voice almost made Lyra believe them, but she couldn't take that chance. She had no idea what the humans would do if they found out she was from another world. She needed to be careful. "I'm not from here," Lyra said cautiously, stepping back a little. "But I'm okay." The child seemed to think for a moment before their face lit up. "Are you like one of those alien things from the movies?" Lyra froze. Movies. The child had seen something like her in their entertainment. It made sense. Humans often depicted alien creatures in their stories. But the question lingered. Was that what they thought she was? A fictional being? Before Lyra could answer, the child's expression changed. "I have to go now," they said, turning and walking away quickly. "But if you ever need help, I'll be around. I'm Sophie, by the way." Lyra watched as Sophie disappeared into the crowd of humans, her mind racing. She had just made contact with a human, and despite her initial hesitation, the encounter had been surprisingly kind. But now, there was even more uncertainty. Was this child's curiosity a sign of kindness, or was it a trap? The settlement wasn't just a place of unknowns. It was now a place where Lyra might find answers, or worse, enemies. She had to tread carefully. Sophie's friendly demeanor had been disarming, but Lyra knew the truth. On this planet, nothing was as simple as it seemed. A bigger threat. Days passed, and Lyra continued to move through the settlement's outskirts, studying the humans from a distance. Sophie had kept her word, never telling anyone about the strange, tiny being she had encountered in the forest. At least, that's what Lyra hoped. She had no way of knowing if Sophie's innocent words were true, but she couldn't help but be cautious. Lyra had become adept at moving through the shadows, always staying one step ahead of the humans. She had even learned some of their language, picking up words here and there. But more than the humans, it was the strange alien presence that had started to bother her, a feeling she couldn't shake. She couldn't place it, but something in the air felt off. It was during one of her solitary walks through the outskirts of the settlement that she first noticed the ships. They were massive, hovering quietly just beyond the tree line, almost completely hidden by the dense canopy of trees. Lyra's eyes widened in fear as she recognized the unmistakable designs, sleek, angular, and unmistakably from her home planet. The ships were unlike anything the humans had, their hulls shimmering in the sunlight with an eerie metallic sheen. They weren't human crafts. They were Tyranian. Her heart raced as she quickly ducked behind a nearby rock, her small frame nearly invisible against the ground. The ships hovered just a few hundred meters away, their engines barely making a sound. There was something unsettling about the way they moved. They didn't seem like they were searching for something. They were waiting. For what? Lyra swallowed hard, her mind racing. It had been weeks since her exile, and she had hoped that Tyrannia would forget about her. But now, it seemed, they hadn't. Her people were here. They had come to find her. But why? She had no way of knowing for sure, but the feeling that gnawed at her was that her exile was not just a punishment. It was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. Perhaps her people had realized that she had survived the wormhole and had found her way to this strange, unknown world. Maybe they had come to finish what they started, or perhaps they were searching for something more. The ships remained stationary, their silent presence making the air around Lyra feel heavier. There was no movement from them, no indication of what their mission was. Still, she couldn't afford to take chances. She decided to follow them at a distance, moving cautiously and remaining out of sight. The ships eventually descended lower into the trees, their landing gear touching down gently on the soft earth. Lyra had no idea how many were inside, but she couldn't risk getting too close. If the Tyrannians discovered her here, they would have no mercy. She watched from the shadows, her breath shallow. The craft's landing seemed almost deliberate, like they were waiting for something or someone. Slowly, the hatch on one of the ships opened, and a figure stepped out. Lyra's heart stopped. It was a Tyrannian soldier, tall, muscular, and adorned in the black and silver armor of the elite forces. His eyes were a deep shade of red, a color that marked him as part of the warrior class. He surveyed the area with a cold, calculating expression. Lyra instinctively ducked lower into the underbrush, her body trembling. If he saw her, it would be over. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the soldiers' every move. More figures emerged from the ship, each one clad in dark, intimidating armor. They were not just here to explore. They were here on a mission. Lyra could feel the weight of their presence, a sense of urgency in their movements. They were methodical, moving in perfect unison, their attention focused. It was clear that they were looking for something, and it wasn't just the shipwrecks or alien technology. They were searching for her. Lyra's throat tightened as she tried to calm her breathing. She had been exiled, cast out for being small and weak. She was no hero, no legend. She had survived by pure chance, but this was different. She wasn't sure if she could survive this. Just as she was about to retreat, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Sophie, Sophie, where are you?" The child's voice. Lyra's heart skipped. She looked to see Sophie running toward the group of soldiers, completely unaware of the danger that surrounded her. The Tyrannians turned their attention to the child immediately, their weapons ready. "Sophie, no." Lyra whispered under her breath. She had to do something. She couldn't let them take the child, not after everything. Sophie had been nothing but kind to her. She had been the only one who didn't judge, the only one who had shown her any semblance of trust. Lyra's mind raced. There was no way she could fight the Tyrannians head-on. She was too small, too weak. But she had one advantage. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know she was the outcast they had exiled. Maybe, just maybe, she could use their ignorance against them. With a sense of resolve, Lyra darted out of the underbrush and into the clearing, staying low. She moved with the speed and precision of a shadow, her heart pounding in her ears. The soldiers, momentarily distracted by Sophie, hadn't noticed her approach. Lyra grabbed a small rock from the ground and hurled it into the opposite side of the clearing. The noise was enough to divert the attention of the nearest soldier. They turned, scanning the area, their weapons trained on the shadows. Now was her chance. Lyra ran toward Sophie, her small legs carrying her quickly through the dense underbrush. Sophie looked up in surprise, her eyes wide. "What are you doing here?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Before Lyra could answer, one of the Tyrannian soldiers shouted, "There, it's the outcast. She's here." Lyra's heart froze. The jig was up. They had found her. But as the soldiers raised their weapons, Lyra knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about her anymore. These invaders weren't just here to find her. They were here to conquer. And Lyra, the tiny exiled outcast, might be the only one who could stop them. Rising to the challenge. The air felt thick with tension. Lyra stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as the Tyrannian soldiers advanced toward her. Their eyes, glowing with that familiar blood-red hue, scanned the surroundings, focusing intently on the small figure in front of them. Sophie, standing beside her, was wide-eyed, too shocked to move. Her small frame trembled, but she didn't take her gaze off the soldiers, as if trying to understand what had just happened. Lyra, on the other hand, was calculating her every move. The odds were stacked against her. There were 5 soldiers, all armed with advanced weaponry, and only one of her. She was small, too small to fight head-on. Yet, she had no choice but to act. The soldier at the front, a towering figure in black armor, stepped forward. His voice, deep and guttural, cut through the air like a blade. "Lyra the Exiled, you've escaped our judgment for too long. Your fate is sealed." Lyra's chest tightened. They knew who she was. It wasn't just a hunt, it was personal. They were here to finish what they had started. But Lyra had changed since her exile. She had learned to survive by relying on her wits and her agility, skills that her people had never valued. Tyrannians believed in brute strength, in conquering through force, but Lyra knew she had to fight with strategy and cunning. "Stay back, Sophie," Lyra whispered urgently, her voice barely a breath. "I'll distract them. You need to run." Sophie didn't move, her eyes locked on Lyra in disbelief. "What are you talking about? We can't. There's no time." Lyra snapped, cutting her off. "I can't let them take you. I won't let them hurt anyone else. Now go." Sophie hesitated for a split second, before nodding, her face pale. She turned and bolted toward the trees, her small form vanishing into the foliage. Lyra didn't watch her go. Her focus was entirely on the soldiers. They were closing in, their footsteps heavy on the ground. The soldier who had spoken earlier raised his weapon, a sleek, high-tech rifle, and aimed it directly at her. "Move," he growled, his voice like thunder. Lyra didn't move. She couldn't. She had no intention of surrendering, not without a fight. The soldier's finger hovered over the trigger. But just as he was about to fire, Lyra dove to the side, rolling smoothly between the legs of another soldier, her small body slipping through their formation like water. She reached for a nearby rock, hurling it into the air to distract them for just a moment. The soldiers flinched, momentarily caught off guard by the sudden noise. But it was enough. Lyra used their brief confusion to her advantage. She sprinted toward the forest, zigzagging between the trees, her speed surprising even herself. She heard the soldiers' footsteps pounding behind her, but they were slower. The thick trees and brush slowed them down, while Lyra, small and nimble, navigated the terrain with ease. She pushed forward, not looking back. There was only one thing on her mind now: survival. Sophie's voice echoed in her mind as she ran. "I won't tell anyone. I promise." The words had been meant to comfort her, but now they felt like a distant memory. Sophie wasn't the only one who had seen Lyra. The Tyrannians had too. The moment they realized who she was, they would stop at nothing to recapture her. Lyra's thoughts whirred as she ran, searching for a way to outsmart them. Her mind raced back to the time she spent learning about Earth, its creatures, its technologies, and its people. She might not have known everything about this world, but she knew one thing for sure: the Tyrannians were not invincible. She had seen their technology up close. The weapons they carried were advanced, yes, but not infallible. Their armor, too, was designed for strength. No thought had been given to speed or flexibility. That was where Lyra had the advantage. She might not be able to overpower them, but she could outmaneuver them. She reached a clearing and skidded to a stop. The sound of the soldiers' footsteps grew louder, closer. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She needed a plan. Fast. Her gaze darted around the clearing. There, a large, hollowed-out tree. It was wide enough for her to hide inside. Lyra crouched low, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the area for any sign of the soldiers. With the soldiers still behind her, she dashed for the tree, sliding inside just in time. The inside was dark and cool, and for a moment, Lyra allowed herself to breathe. But only for a moment. She listened intently, her breath steadying. The sound of the soldiers grew louder as they entered the clearing, their voices harsh and grating. "We know you're here, Lyra. Come out now. You cannot hide forever." Lyra clenched her fists, willing her heart to stay calm. She could hear them searching, their heavy footsteps growing closer to her hiding place. If they found her now, she was finished. She had to make them think she was farther away, somewhere out of reach. Slowly, she inched her way to the far side of the tree and pressed herself against the rough bark. She took a deep breath and reached into the small pouch at her side. Inside, she had a few tools she had scavenged from the humans. Simple objects, but useful. She pulled out a small mirror and held it at an angle, reflecting the faint sunlight in the direction of the soldiers. The mirror shimmered, catching their attention. A soldier turned his head, his red eyes narrowing. "Did you see that?" he asked. "She's trying to trick us." Lyra held her breath, praying the distraction would work. Another soldier growled. "We'll see about that." The footsteps grew distant. Lyra felt a flicker of hope, but she wasn't safe yet. The soldiers had been fooled, but they wouldn't give up so easily. She could hear their voices fading, but it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and came back stronger, more determined. She had only a few minutes to prepare before they found her again. Her plan had worked, but the real test was about to begin. Lyra's mind raced. She had to do more than hide. She needed to strike back, and for that, she would need to use every ounce of cunning she had. The Tyrannians had underestimated her, and she would make them regret it. The only question now was how. And she would figure it out, no matter what it took. The final plan. The days that followed were tense, filled with uncertainty. Lyra had evaded the Tyrannian soldiers, barely, but she knew they wouldn't stop hunting her. They were relentless, a well-trained force used to getting what they wanted. And what they wanted was her. She could feel the weight of that truth pressing on her chest every time she heard their footsteps in the distance or the distant hum of their ships above. But as time passed, something inside her began to shift. Fear was still there, but so was something else, a flicker of determination, a resolve she hadn't known she was capable of. She had been exiled, cast aside, dismissed as weak and insignificant by her people. But now, with the fate of not just herself, but an entire world on the line, Lyra understood one thing: she wasn't weak. She was different, and that difference could be her greatest strength. Lyra had spent every waking hour over the past week hiding, watching, and learning. The Tyrannians were methodical in their search. They didn't rush or make mistakes. They moved in silent, calculated formations. But Lyra had begun to recognize their patterns, to predict their movements, and more importantly, she had been observing something that had given her hope. Their weapons, while powerful, had weaknesses. They relied on brute force, expecting to overwhelm their opponents with sheer power. But the truth was, they had little understanding of Earth's natural landscape, how the terrain could shift, how their ships were vulnerable to Earth's atmosphere. They had underestimated not only her, but this entire world. Lyra had a plan, a risky one, but a plan nonetheless. The Tyrannians had been patrolling the outskirts of the settlement for days, searching for any sign of Lyra. But every night, they made the same mistake. They camped just outside the forest, far from the cover of the trees. Lyra had watched them carefully, waiting for the right moment. That moment had arrived. Lyra had studied the Tyrannian ships, no easy feat, since they were nearly indestructible by normal means. However, their propulsion system was based on a delicate balance of energy, one that, if disrupted, could cause a catastrophic malfunction. Lyra wasn't sure how much she could sabotage, but she knew enough to get started. She had watched the soldiers' routines long enough to figure out the weak points of their technology. The plan was simple, in theory. She would infiltrate their camp at night, disable one of their ships, and create enough confusion to give her a chance to strike back. But Lyra was well aware that her size, her alien appearance, and her knowledge of their technology made her a target, and a small, vulnerable one at that. The first step in her plan was simple: distraction. The Tyranians always kept 2 soldiers on watch near the perimeter, stationed at the farthest point of their camp. They had their own little routine: check the perimeter, report in, and occasionally scan the nearby woods for anything unusual. But Lyra knew the layout of the camp better than they did. She had studied their movements closely enough to know exactly when and where they would be. As night fell, she crept silently through the trees, a small bundle of tools clutched tightly in her hands. She had crafted makeshift explosives from the materials she had scavenged, simple but effective enough to cause a diversion. The Tyranians might have superior technology, but Lyra knew how to make use of what was available. She set the first device near the edge of their camp, where the ground was thick with brush and the trees were dense. She activated the timer and quickly retreated into the shadows, careful not to alert any of the soldiers. The explosive would give her just enough time to slip past their defenses. As the minutes ticked by, Lyra felt the knot in her stomach tighten. She could hear the soldiers patrolling the area, their heavy boots thudding against the ground, their voices low and gruff. She knew they weren't far off now. She had to time this perfectly. The explosion went off with a loud, ear-splitting bang. The ground trembled, and a plume of smoke erupted into the air, lighting up the surrounding trees in an eerie, fiery glow. The Tyranian soldiers immediately scrambled, shouting orders at each other. Lyra moved quickly, using the chaos as cover. She darted through the shadows, her small body slipping easily between the trees. She didn't stop to look back, focusing only on the ship she had marked earlier. As she reached the ship, her heart pounded in her chest. The ship's hull loomed above her, massive and intimidating, but Lyra had no time for fear. She had studied it for days, memorizing the layout and the weak points. Her eyes scanned the surface, and then she found it: the access panel, hidden beneath a series of protective covers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With practiced hands, Lyra carefully pried open the panel, revealing a set of intricate wires and circuits. The ship's energy source was contained within a fragile system, one that could be disrupted if handled correctly. She had no formal training, but she was quick to learn, and Earth's simpler technologies had given her the confidence to work faster. A few snips of the wires, and the ship's engines would be down for the count. She just needed one final push. Lyra's fingers hovered over the wires, her breath shallow. A slight misstep could destroy everything, but she was running out of time. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and snipped the final wire. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the ship's systems began to whir. The lights flickered as the power supply began to destabilize. Lyra's heart leaped. This was it. The ship was down, and the Tyranians would be thrown into disarray. Just as she turned to leave, the ship's alarms blared, and the camp erupted into chaos. Lyra knew it was time to go. She sprinted back into the woods, her small form darting between trees as the sounds of shouting soldiers grew louder behind her. The explosion had worked. Her plan was succeeding. But now, it was only a matter of time before the Tyranians regrouped. Lyra needed to act fast. The fate of Earth, and her own, rested on what she did next. The final phase of the plan was in motion, and Lyra could only hope she had done enough to tip the scales. She might have been small, but her strength lay in her ability to think, to adapt, and to survive. And tonight, the Tyranians would learn that underestimating her was the biggest mistake they could have made. The legend of Lyra. The night had fallen silent once again, but the stillness was far from peaceful. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched low behind a massive tree, watching the chaos unfold in the Tyranian camp. The explosion had caused exactly what she hoped for, a massive disruption in their operations. But now the soldiers were regrouping, quickly realizing that something had gone wrong. Their massive ships, once hovering with ominous calmness, were now flickering in and out, their power sources on the verge of total collapse. Lyra could see them scrambling, their towering figures moving quickly through the camp as they tried to make sense of the sabotage. But she didn't have time to savor the moment of victory. The soldiers would recover soon, and the clock was ticking. She had given them a taste of her power, but she needed to ensure it didn't end with her being caught or worse, killed. She had to act quickly. As the Tyranians moved closer to their disabled ship, Lyra crept silently through the shadows, darting between trees and rocks, never allowing herself to be spotted. Her small size, once considered a weakness, had become her greatest asset. The soldiers, powerful and imposing, were now struggling to adjust to her unpredictable movements. They weren't used to fighting an opponent like her, one who relied on wit and agility rather than sheer force. Lyra's mind was racing. She had succeeded in disabling one of their ships, but it wasn't enough. There was still a bigger threat looming. If the Tyranians were here, there was no way they would leave without completing their mission. They had come for her, and they would stop at nothing to recapture her, or worse, destroy everything she had worked for. But Lyra wasn't alone anymore. Sophie, the child who had shown her kindness, who had believed in her when no one else did. Lyra couldn't afford to let the Tyranians harm her. She had to protect her at all costs. Sophie had gone back to the settlement, seeking refuge with her family, but Lyra had been watching her from a distance. She knew the moment she had come into contact with Sophie that the child had become a part of this story. Her innocence, her curiosity had turned into something more, something dangerous, and something beautiful. She had trusted Lyra, and now Lyra couldn't let that trust go unprotected. The plan had worked. The Tyranians were disoriented, but they would be back. They were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone in their path if it meant capturing her. Lyra didn't know how much longer she could keep running. That's when she saw it, the signal, a small faint light flashing from the tree line on the opposite side of the camp. Her heart skipped. Sophie. She had made her move, and somehow Lyra had known that she would. The child was braver than anyone gave her credit for. It was a signal. Sophie was offering help, showing her where to strike next. Lyra's hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what was happening. This was it. The final phase of her plan was coming together. She had to finish what she started. She moved swiftly toward the light, the shadows now her ally, as the Tyranians continued to struggle with their damaged ship. The soldiers were distracted, but they wouldn't be for long. Lyra knew this was the one chance they had to put an end to the invasion. When Lyra reached Sophie, the child looked at her with wide eyes. But there was no fear, only determination. "You came," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I knew you would." Lyra smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knelt beside the child. "You've done well. Now, we finish this." Sophie nodded, her face set in a serious expression. She had grown up in these past few days, the innocence of childhood replaced with the strength of someone who had seen too much too soon. She was no longer just a curious child. She was part of the fight. Lyra took a deep breath and turned to look at the chaos unfolding in the Tyranian camp. She could hear the soldiers' angry voices now, their frustration rising as they realized that the damage to their ship was beyond their control. Some of them began searching the perimeter again, and others were hastily calling for reinforcements. This was their moment. Lyra whispered instructions to Sophie, and the two of them moved quickly into position, carefully planning their next move. They had one shot at this. If they missed, it would all be over. There was no turning back. Lyra had studied the ship's engines long enough to know its weak points. With Sophie's help, they managed to sneak back to the ship's underside, avoiding the soldiers and using the shadows as their cover. Lyra pulled out the remaining tools from her pack, the makeshift explosives, the small devices she had designed from Earth's materials, all of it carefully crafted for one final strike. She set the charges around the critical points of the ship's engine, just beneath the hull where the energy core fed into the propulsion system. If she could destabilize this core just enough, it would trigger a chain reaction that would disable the rest of the fleet. Lyra took a deep breath. She had done everything she could to understand the enemy. Now, she had to make sure they couldn't retaliate. Once the final charge was set, she turned to Sophie, who was watching her with intense eyes. "Go," Lyra said, her voice firm. "This is your moment. Run, as fast as you can." Sophie hesitated for a moment, then nodded, bolting into the forest, her small figure disappearing between the trees. Lyra watched her go, her heart in her throat. She wasn't sure if she would ever see the child again, but she knew that Sophie had become a symbol of something far greater than either of them. She had become the spark that would ignite the change on Earth. Lyra turned back to the ship, her breath steadying. The countdown had begun. She knew it would be close, but there was no turning back. She triggered the detonator, the timer ticking down with each passing second. In that moment, Lyra realized something she hadn't fully grasped before. This world was her home now. Earth, with all its beauty and danger, had become her battleground. She had been exiled, cast away like a piece of discarded debris. But now, she had a purpose. The universe might have been vast, and Tyrannia might have thought her weak, but they had underestimated Earth, and they had underestimated her. The explosion rippled through the camp like a wave, sending a shockwave through the forest. Lyra stood tall, watching the chaos unfold in front of her. The Tyrannians, once so confident, were now reeling. The energy core had exploded, disabling the ships and sending the invaders into a disarray they hadn't anticipated. Lyra didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran into the darkness, her heart racing, but her mind clear. She was no longer an exile. She was no longer a fugitive. She was a legend. And the story of how she saved Earth was just beginning.